Hello and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And welcome to our show. If you are new to the show, or if you have just been here for a while, I always like to start off the show by saying, please like and subscribe and comment. We really need people to like and subscribe and comment. It gives us a sense of if we're doing a good job or if we're doing a terrible job and what we'd like to see on the show. Hey, Randall, what's a great way to get in touch with us?
We'll just go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, and you can find different ways to contact us. Our Facebook page is good. You could email us.
Yeah, these are all excellent ways. Really looking forward to it. I really want to thank those people who have commented and have made suggestions. This is going to be a really fun one. We're going back again. I've got a new or old background of me outdoors in a beach, and I honestly don't remember which beach it is. Randall, what is your backdrop? I've been trying to think about that for a while.
This is a picture I took at Descanso Gardens when they had a light show at night.
Nice.
They used to do it every year before COVID.
Yeah. Well, I miss those, and I think this is one of the many beaches I've been to of late. And I'm going to let our viewers in on a little secret. Neither Randall or I, despite the photos behind us, are actually outside.
That's true.
I am actually in a satellite orbiting space, and you are 1,000 miles underground in a hidden bunker.
Yeah, that's right. I'm in
an old nuclear siler. So we're using these photos of real places to create the illusion that we're in a real place, because psychologically, when you see real places, you just naturally assume that it's the suspension of disbelief. And that brings us to our show. It's a film show, this one. We are big fans of 1970s filmmaking, and there's a lot of different distinctive natures about it. But what's kind of really, I think, very cool about 1970s Hollywood, and I'm using Hollywood in the most liberal way, is that it got into the world again, and it started showing the world, real world. So we're going to cover a few films that we really feel deal with location, naturalism, set design, and the difference between saying what had been before it and what will come after it. Randall, why don't you expand? This is your baby.
Yeah, so the 1970s, there was a real shift in the paradigm of production design in movies, usually known as art design, although in 1939's Gone with the Wind, they made up a title called a production designer, who's really just the art designer. So you can use the titles interchangeably. And even today, there's still a lot of confusion when people will say production design, they mean art design. They say art design, they mean production design. So from now on the show, let's just call it say production design, because that seems to be what we're supposed to be using now.
Well, I definitely am all for using the actual word. So, I mean, that's the key.
I mean, some movies don't even have a production designer; they'll have an art designer, but the art designer is really the production designer. But okay, but it gets too complicated. We're just gonna say production designer. So. In the beginning, let's go back to the beginning of movies. So in the beginning, they shot everything outside because there were no studios, there were no sound stages. So like the Keystone Cops are a great example. You know, they just went out on the street and shot a bunch of crazy neck-breaking stunts all over the place. And eventually, when you're churning out these films, it was these production companies found it easier to move to a studio, a controlled space, where you wouldn't keep running afoul of the law in the local community who's getting tired of you shooting all this stuff in their backyard and ruining their stuff. So what you get is just this era of the golden age of Hollywood, which and a movie making, which lasts somewhere, I want to say like the 20s, maybe even earlier, to the World War II. So during this era, you had a lot of big Hollywood production companies, a lot of production companies all over the world just churning out product, making them on studios, making them on backlots. A backlot is basically like an outdoor studio And when talkies came in, when sound capture came in the 30s, all the studios had to change into what they call sound stages. And that's just a studio where it's protected for sound. It's insulated for sound.
That's how it got its name. Huh? I did not know that.
That's right. It's a sound stage because you're recording sound on it. So anyway, what happens is everything's going fine. And there are some exceptions. I mean, people are still going outside of their studios and sound stages to shoot on
like
location.
Westerns.
Well, interesting thing about Westerns is Westerns were usually shot on a backlot. So it's a controlled space. It's on a lot owned by the studio. It's outdoors. But the interesting thing about it is it's not a real town. They would construct a fake town. So like if you go on the Universal Studios tour even today here in Hollywood, you can see the fake city. There's a fake city in the middle of Universal Studios that has been used for Westerns, period dramas, all sorts of things. And, it's constantly being taken apart and put back together.
What's it like?
Well, it looks great. It looks like a little city, but it looks different depending on what they're shooting there. Have
you been on any of the other fake cities? I've been on 2. I've been at the Paramount New York lot, where actually I've been on 3. What am I saying? And it's in the Paramount lot where they did Spider-Man 2. I have been at the Fox lot, which is called the New York lot, which a lot of cop shows and Seinfeld used. And I was on the old MGM lot, which is Sony. And that was actually not a fake city lot. That was a sound stage. And that was for Spider-Man 1. And you are right. It's like when you're either, like if you're in a sound stage, it's like a giant air hangar. Is that the best way to describe it?
Yeah, it looks like a giant air hangar. It's a giant space where they can construct a fake city in that giant space too if they'd like. But the problem with that is you can control the sound, so that's the advantage. But the problem with that is now you have to add a bunch of artificial lights. And so if you're shooting like a daylight scene, it's lit by fake lighting. And it doesn't look as real as it would if it was shot on a back lot.
And if you're like in the outdoor lot, like the New York lot, say at Fox, it's really a manipulation of perspective. I don't think there's a single building over 5 stories on any of the New York lots. But,
well, traditionally, yes. Traditionally in the Westerns, they built all the structures to be small. Like they built them to be small so that all the Western superstars would look larger than life.
Yeah. But even if you're like in a New York City lot where they did like Hello Dolly or any of the TV shows you watch today or any of the historical movies that took place in cities, you rarely see a roof. Almost everything is at like ground level. And then when they go further for an establishing shot, it could just be some B-roll or a model, but it's never really more than a few feet above. Never more than 1 or 2 stories above a normal person.
Yeah, and this gets to something else I wanted to mention, because the cinema, it really, there's 2 different aesthetic. I see the cinema as there's 2 different aesthetic visions that compete in the cinema. One is the aesthetic vision from the theater, and the other is the aesthetic vision from photography. And the theater, of course, is much older than photography, and I would argue it's way more influential in cinema than photography is. And so what you're talking about, Chris, where you don't see ceilings, you don't see floors, you only see like
it's indicative, as what we would say in theater. In theater staging, even whether it's naturalistic or expressionistic, there's a limit to what you can physically put on a stage. So you put things on the stage that indicate there is more than the eye can see, and you manipulate perspective.
Right. That's another reason for making the structure smaller, right? To give more depth illusion. But the thing with photography is, in photography, the aesthetics of photography are always trying to capture the real, or at least that's what a lot of photography is about. You're trying to capture something that's real. So you fast forward to a movie like I'll get to that again in a second. 2001. Now Stanley Kubrick is he's an amateur, semi-professional photographer, and then he becomes a movie director. And so you can see in all of his movies, he is attempting to fill the frame with what looks real, with a picture that looks completely convincing. Wouldn't you say, Chris? I mean, 2001.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Even as I'm looking at just as this photo of myself, for those of you who are watching versus listening, I'm standing here. It's a photo of me on top of a beach, and I can see beach, people, some flowers, mountains, sky, water. The perspective, even though it's not a cluttered photo, is full of shading, lighting, and color that it'd be very hard to recreate in a 1940s soundstage, much less even a 1940s, fake New York.
Well, yeah. I mean, and that's a real photograph. You didn't build that beach on a soundstage like on Gilligan's Island or something like that, right? I remember watching Gilligan's Island.
And the lighting that you see behind me is actual natural lighting.
That's sunlight
and sky.
Right. You didn't shoot the beach with a bunch of Klieg lights to try to at night to try to make it look like it was day.
I deliberately chose a photo that had no filters, so that it would actually just be as naturalistic.
Well, I think it looks
possible.
Great. I think it looks great. So anyway, what happens is, so the movie industry, it's really running on a theater aesthetic. They're creating sets that are very theatrical. And if you watch, from the 1920s through the 1950s, and if you watch any of the movies from that era, I mean, you would agree with me, Chris, right? If you watch a movie from the golden age of Hollywood, and it's on a set, you immediately see that it's on a set. I mean, the aesthetics are not convincing.
With the exception of a few blockbusters like Gone with the Wind, the best work on sound stages are the expressionistic works, the stuff that are informed by Germans and deal with lighting. But you're right.
Indicative, as you said
right.
Before,
well,
right?
Gone with the Wind is a very unique movie in that I've actually been on the lot at Culver City MGM where they filmed it. But Gone with the Wind is very much like Westerns, where you have some degree of outdoor work with cameras, dollying in real places. But anything that was filmed outdoors in old Hollywood, if it was truly filmed outdoors like that, or, some of Birth of a Nation or any of the Griffith films, they're epic. If they're going to film outside, they're throwing every penny they've got. And it, weirdly enough, adds another layer of artificiality. Because
everything in that golden era, everything you see on screen, like Gone with the Wind's a perfect example. Everything you see on screen was artificially created by somebody in the production.
Right. So if this photo behind me had different kinds of filters and lighting, there would be a way of making this photo pop behind me, and it would look beautiful, but it would almost look like a painting and less than real.
Right.
Because that was the dominant aesthetic of color. Color was, when color broke into filmmaking, they didn't just, they wanted it to be bright, iridescent. They wanted it to be decorative. The point of color was not so much to reproduce reality as to show a stark contrast to black and white, which was the play of shadow and light.
Yeah, that's true. There was definitely the theater aesthetic, and even in the theater, the idea of controlling color to the extent that they did in classic Hollywood. I mean, it was the same aesthetic, wouldn't you say, in the theater?
Absolutely. So
even
what
today,
what comes about to shake
well, what
things
happens?
up, Randall?
This is the interesting thing. The whole paradigm shifts to the aesthetic of photography after World War II because Europe is completely reduced to rubble. A lot of whole cities are leveled, and that includes movie studios. And the Italians, I think it was the Italians who really were the first to get the idea. Okay, our studio's bombed, but our camera lived. So why don't we go out and take this camera and just start shooting stuff in our bombed out city? And that aesthetic, that era, that movement that they started is today called Italian neo-realism. And I think a great movie from that from that out of that is the Bicycle Thieves from 1948. So if you want to
By
watch
Vittorio De Sica.
if you want to watch a good example of Italian neorealism, that's what I'd recommend.
Was that filmed in Rome?
I believe it was filmed in Rome. Yes,
right after the war.
So yeah, and you can see the bombed out city in that movie.
And they're filming street scenes with actual people walking. The actors
real
are
people
doing their work, and as the actors are acting and the film is being filmed, real people are walking around, and no releases signed back then, But people are just, whatever's going on in the background of Bicycle Thief is just whatever was going on in Rome that day.
Right, and so that idea when you watch like Bicycle Thieves today, you're immediately struck by how modern it looks. I feel any movies from that era, that time, shot outside.
Yeah, because it's the streets are real Roman streets. The actors and the people in the background are wearing regular people clothing. Outside of our leading actors, the people in the background are not wearing makeup. They don't have a very intricate lighting or sound crew. So whatever noises we see, a lot of that is just what's there. And the state of the buildings are the state of the actual buildings.
Well, one advantage that the Italians had at that time was they didn't record sync sound. Like, they didn't really have sound stages in Europe, a lot of Europe. What they did was, even today, they re-loop all the dialogue. So they don't even record dialogue on set. They just record dialogue in different languages after the whole thing is shot and edited. So like the spaghetti westerns are like that.
And I guess also this, in a way, when you have a real city like Rome, which is a beautiful city, but even if it was not, it becomes a character in the film.
Right. Well, if you want to shoot the real Rome, like if you're going into Rome and you're going to try to capture the real Rome instead of like trying to dress it up or change it in some way to fit some kind of vision, then yeah, it becomes it totally becomes a character. So that idea spread all throughout Europe, and
it's. I just want to last one point. It's not pretty Rome. Like, no. Yeah, I know what everyone's saying, but what about all those movies that take place in Rome? But when you see pretty Rome, then it's not real Rome. It's the Rome of the travel brochure that people want to escape to. And once you get to real Rome, you realize that travel brochure does exist, but it exists hand in hand with a living city, no different than any living city anywhere else in the world. True.
Well, I just want to go on with the timeline just to get this going.
Yeah.
So in 1948, Hollywood was divested of their theaters. I mean, Hollywood used to own the theaters and the studios, and so European movies weren't being seen in America. So in 1948, Congress changed that. They broke the monopoly, and suddenly you get all these Italian neorealism films in Hollywood in America. And then in 1951, the Cahiers du Cinéma guys founded Cahiers du Cinéma, which is like a incredibly influential.
These were French filmmakers and theoreticians, people like Louis Malle, Jean-Luc Godard, Francois Truffaut, who looked at American films and Italian films and were trying to find that synthesis, trying to find a theory of how to make film that, as you say, is more in alignment with photography and not so much with the theatricality.
I'll just say something about the Cahiers du Cinéma guys. They're kind of like Eisenstein over in the USSR. So in 1951, when they founded the magazine, France is also bombed out. Well, France is doing okay, but they're still suffering after the war. Their film industry hasn't totally recovered. And they're just a bunch of guys that they're not imagining they're going to become film directors. And so they start this critical magazine about the cinema. And so they come up with all these like theories about, like you just said, all these theories about the cinema. And so they work on that for a few years, and then suddenly they get the opportunity to make some movies.
Well, in fairness, Malle and Clouzot weren't really members of the Cahiers du Cinéma. They're considered New Wave filmmakers, but they are making films in just regular parts of Paris or just France. They're mostly working on crime stories, but using as many real elements in order to tell that story. Outdoors, real locales.
Right. That's called the French New Wave. And then one of the breakout movies from that is 1959, The 400 Blows, which is a big hit all over the world. Now, these movies are all being seen in America. So the first movie in America that's really influenced by these movements is probably Bonnie and Clyde from 1967. Wouldn't you say, Chris?
Well, I actually think you need to look at Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard, which comes just a little bit after.
Oh yeah, Breathless
400
is
Blows,
very influential. Yeah,
and that very much influences Hal Ashby when he directs Bonnie and Clyde. There's a lot of, I know this because I studied it in college. I'm not really that smart. But the use of jump cuts and the way that there's a lot of Breathless is about a man and a woman who go on the run. It's got crime, it's got violence, it has a sense of travel and place. These elements are interpreted within a Hollywood lens by Hal Ashby, with actors like Warren Beatty and Vanessa Redgrave. I'm sorry, not Vanessa Redgrave. Damn it, what's her name?
I don't know. I can't remember.
She was in Network.
Oh,
Faye Dunaway. Thank you.
Dunaway, right.
So Faye Dunaway, Michael Pollard. Anyway, continue on because it's a seminal and transitionary film.
Yeah, so Bonnie and Clyde's interesting. You know, Bonnie and Clyde is one of the first uses of squibs in a Hollywood movie. So a squib, is a fake blood explosion out of somebody's shirt. It looks like a bullet just went into you and blood explodes out. I mean, this is the kind of thing they're getting more obsessed with visual realism in Hollywood.
And
is my point.
Prior to Bonnie and Clyde, these kinds of movies like White Heat, Public Enemy, these were the classic soundstage films.
Right. And in those old movies, if you got shot, you just clutched your chest and fell to the ground. You didn't see any blood, right?
Right.
So in 1968, 2001 comes out. Kubrick's obsessed with the visual. 68, I think 68 too is Easy Rider.
And then when you're looking at 2001: A Space Odyssey, there's two different ways of looking at naturalism. There is the part that takes place in the past that was filmed, and it's outdoors, it's real places. There's also an interior naturalism to the set design of 2001 that gives it a dirtiness, an industrial quality. Even though it is filmed technically on a soundstage, it brings a hypernaturalism to make it seem and feel much more. It doesn't have the cleanness. It doesn't have the artificiality of, say, a Forbidden Planet or a Star Trek, right?
Yeah, if you compare 2001 to science fiction previous, it doesn't look as cartoony. There's so much more detail in 2001. And the detail is more convincing. You look at the detail and you think, oh, yeah, that could be a real computer. That could be like a real spacesuit.
And he used real things. There's a lot of actual furniture, very expensive furniture, but it's designer furniture. It's designer clothing. Instead of having stuff made, he found things in the real world that just have a very high-tech look. Today, you can't watch a science fiction movie or TV show without that stuff. But he was really the first person to say, I'm just going to go and buy real-made materials that do just look futuristic, but you could literally buy it in an expensive showroom for furnishings or for designers. And that will create, because it is real, your mind already knows that on some subconscious level.
Yeah, and it's so weird for us to be talking about this, how we're saying, these the people making these movies were trying to make the movie look real. I mean, this is like, this idea is it's revolutionary, but it seems so silly to talk about it in that way. But that's really what happened. Suddenly, people making movies, especially production designers, they started thinking, well, I want this movie to look like photorealistic, like a photograph, like it actually happened. It's going to be ultra convincing. And one of the ways to get that realism is not to make it, but to go out on location, which is a lot of these movies do, right? So Easy Rider was a travel picture. It went all across the country. Midnight Cowboy used New York as its location. New York is basically becomes a character, and then we get to the movies we wanted to talk about a little bit more deeply today, right, Chris? So
right. So once the 70s come, it's not, as you just said, there's plenty of antecedents. And most of the filmmakers we're going to discuss today are young men of that earlier generation who had been students of film who had grown up watching those things or were contemporaries but not yet making films. So I really think that if, especially because Midnight Cowboy, directed by John Schlesinger, screenplay by Waldo Salt, starring Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman. I'm not going to talk about it. I just wanted to give you a sense of it. That is a New York story. The characters are poor. They represent the underbelly of New York. It's filmed entirely in New York City. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Keep in mind, the film that won the year before that was a studio soundstage musical. So it's a tremendous shift between, I don't remember which soundstage musical. That's why I'm not giving you the precise one.
But
my point is this, that you go from like Dr. Dolittle and My Fair Lady, which are just beautiful movies, but complete soundstage works, to something that is shot very much in the style of a French New Wave filmmaker or Vittorio De Sica. Now, here's what's interesting. I'm going to start off with The French Connection by William Friedkin, 1972. The thing about The French Connection is it has those elements. It also has the elements of Bonnie and Clyde. But The French Connection is, at its heart, what they call a police story. It's based on a real heroin exporting ring that happened to New York City in the 1960s. Friedkin actually was basing it on a real detective who broke the ring. Everything about it is factually accurate. And unlike films that are trying to explore more philosophical bents, this is really an action film. This is a movie that is shot. If you guys are fans of Law and Order, this is like a procedural. You know what I'm saying? It's, he uses real locations. He works with real detectives, real police cars, real sites. New York City of the early 70s is pretty much an easy double for New York of the 1960s. It's where the city is at. One of the most famous scenes in it, actually another film we could have talked about was Bullitt, which has a wonderful chase scene, a car chase scene down San Francisco. Friedkin loved that scene so much that he hired the stunt driver from that scene. And there's a chase scene where there's an elevated train and they have to go after the guy who's on the subway. And I think it's in Brooklyn. It could be in the Bronx. It's one of the two places that have elevated subways, or Queens. Manhattan does not have elevated subways at this point in history. And it's just Friedkin, the driver who's the stunt coordinator, and a cameraman. And they're just literally no permits, just in the middle of the morning, driving at they're just gunning it at 60 miles an hour. They actually hit a car.
And there's also a bunch of extras, quote unquote, running away from the car in terror as it barrels down the street. And if Friedkin's right, as he tells it, he just shot it with no permits or anything. Those aren't extras. Those are real people who think they're about to get killed by a crazy driver. And they're in the movie.
Yeah, they're in the movie. Just like in the background of the bars and pool halls are ex-cons and real detectives. If you watch The Wire, you can see it even in a show like The Wire, that there's so much. The mise en scène, as the French New Wave filmmakers would say, is so rich in The French Connection. The city of New York, the underbelly, what makes it dark and nasty. And yet it is, by all rights, a ridiculously conventional film. It is just a movie about a New York City cop trying to stop an international drug ring. There's nothing about it that is very deep. And yet the city today, you would only make a movie. Today, if you were going to make a movie that was a cop movie, you would have to do it like The French Connection. Almost every movie you see today that takes place in New York City that has to do with crime stopping utilizes the same way of framing the city.
I just want to say about Law and Order. I'm not sure if it's still in production, but
so Special Victims Unit is.
Well, I believe the Law and Order shows whatever city they're supposed to be shooting in.
New York City.
For there's different ones, right, in different cities, but
No, just
Is New York just the
well,
only one?
in this country, yes.
Well, anyway, well, there used to be like a Vegas one or something, but
You're thinking of CSI.
oh, am I thinking CSI? But anyway, there, I think in Law and Order, they like for a few months out of every year or a couple of months or something, they go to New York and they shoot all the exteriors for
No,
the season.
all of Law and Order is filmed in New York City.
Oh, is New York the one shot?
Think,
Okay.
Yeah, you may be
I'm thinking of a different
NYPD
show.
Blue. Right. So Law and Order,
There,
they have a 9-day shoot or 7-day shoot. They shoot on 4 blocks of New York, and everything that happens that's not on their soundstage, which is in New York, it's a very small soundstage. So they only use the courtroom and the police station for the soundstage. Every building, everywhere else is a real apartment. It's the same thing when you're watching French Connection. Everything you're seeing is a real place. But if that's a very conventional police year, let's talk about another movie that comes right after that. Let's see, because Taxi Driver came out French Connection 71, Taxi Driver is 76. So it's about 5 years later. Now, Taxi Driver is a serious drama. And instead of it being about solving a crime, it's more about the nature of crime. Talk about how what you've been talking about works in a film like Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese.
well, Taxi Driver, I mean, it's the same idea of Chinatown French Connection. I mean, it's set in New York. It's shot all over New York. I'll read this little paragraph from Wikipedia. Shooting took place on New York's West Side at a time when the city was on the brink of bankruptcy. According to producer Michael Phillips, the whole West Side was bombed out. There really were row after row of condemned buildings, and that's what we used to build our sets, were condemned buildings. Now it's fashionable real estate. But New York and Times Square was shuddering and disgusting. It's just exciting to see the city bounce back and become the great place it is today from where it was then. We didn't know we were documenting what looked like the dying gasp of New York. Now,
I was actually alive for that.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm alive for French Connection, but I'm 5. Whereas when I watched Taxi Driver, and I didn't see Taxi Driver in the theater until I was in college. So it's not something I watched in its time. But the part of New York City of Manhattan that they're showing, especially Times Square, of the porn houses and the old shuttered tenant buildings, it feeds the story. And it even feeds the story in a way far more so than in French Connection, because French Connection is a criminal underbelly, whereas the New York of the mid-'70s, that was a city, that's when the daily, that famous Daily News article, Forward to New York, dropped dead. That was the real New York. That was a city that was having budget issues, crime issues. New York was not made to look darker in Taxi Driver. That's more of a story about That's a story about what life is today. I'm trying to think of a film that came out recently, and I'm just drawing a blank about what life is like today. But that is a very particular moment in time. And as I said, they really didn't have to do anything to get that emotional. If they had made that on a soundstage, they would have had to give it expressionistic lighting and darkening. If you look at a crime film from the 1940s shot in Hollywood, to compare it to, it would have had, a score and lighting and buildings that looked very like a painting. It'd be psychologically painterly. You talk about the theatricality, it looks like the photos of that period.
Yeah, when the director and cinematographer go to shoot the set of that hypothetical movie you're talking about, shot in the studio, they have many fewer options, because when they build the set, it's only going to look right from certain angles.
Yeah.
And so when you get to this location shooting in the 70s, cinematographers have a lot of freedom to move their camera wherever they like. Directors have a lot of freedom to move their camera wherever they like. I mean, Martin Scorsese as a director is really famous for camera movement. And when you watch Taxi Driver, the camera is moving all over the place. If Scorsese had tried to make a Taxi Driver on a set, it's funny to even think about how it looks.
I think the screenwriter Paul Schrader had actually been a taxi driver. So there is even the screenplay again is informed by a certain degree of realism, psychological realism, a real sense of grit that makes you feel that what you're watching is less melodrama and more docudrama. And it's important because that makes the political element and the socioeconomic element of that story outweigh what would have been a very traditional story about a psychotic person or a crazy person. And I want to get to Chinatown because you mentioned it. Chinatown, filmed in Los Angeles and not filmed as a contemporary Los Angeles. And Los Angeles was quite beautiful in the 70s, unlike New York. But Chinatown would have been a film that you could have easily made in the 1930s through 50s. You know, if you compare that, say, to Double Indemnity by the great Billy Wilder, you know, it's an LA story, but they went about the parts of LA that would have been around during the 30s and 40s, even though the story is really about William Mulholland, which occurs at the beginning of the 20th century. But Roman Polanski, what am I saying? Roman Polanski, who is more of a 60s new wave filmmaker, is actually a bit older than some of the people we've talked about. He is able to show how you can actually use a real city, a real location, but a city, which we always think of as the height of modernity, and frame it in a way where you actually feel like you're in the past, which had up until that point really been the domain of soundstage films. I mean, it is one of the most soundstage looking naturalistic films of that period.
I think that's mostly due to the fact that there's a lot of night scenes and they're artificially lit. I mean, would you agree with that?
Well, I mean that as a compliment. So yeah, I see what you're saying. But even the day scenes, the way they pick very archetypal parts of LA, the way they film it, it does feel, when you use a real city and you just look at the buildings that would have been there in that period in history, and then you put some period authentic cars there that are the actual cars, and you dress people up in clothing that's very similar, but you keep the lighting natural and you keep it outdoors, especially in the final scene of the film is very important that way. Again, it elevates it in a way that's past traditional melodrama. And I love Double Indemnity. I'm not knocking it or Sunset Boulevard, but the very fact that Wilder had to deal with the limitations of sound stages means that the world that the story is taking place is never a world that we fully see. Whereas the world of Jake Getz's Chinatown of LA at that period, it's expansive. And you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like when you play a video game and you can wander the whole environment. It makes that environment seem that much. And again, another film, much like the two we just mentioned, where the city is the character, the neighborhood is the counter. This is Chinatown, Jake, is what closes the story. It's what Robert Towne writes. And you have to believe that Chinatown and this part of LA and this history of LA is 100% real, or even more so than French Connection or Taxi Driver. If you don't believe in the reality of the world that's been created, then the ending of the film doesn't work. Because that's how important the John Huston character has to be. That's how important the story has to be, because it is a story about the founding of LA. And it's funny too, because strangely enough, especially if you see like LA Confidential, there's now, even Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there is a legacy that Chinatown basically left us with of telling great stories about early Los Angeles by using actual Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine going backwards and shooting any of these movies you mentioned on a soundstage, isn't it? I mean,
so let's get out of the city and let's go out into nature and let's talk about two films that you would never think about being in the same breath. They're only a year apart in age. Steven Spielberg's Jaws, and that's 1975, and Michael Cimino's, 3 years later, The Deer Hunter. So you know the story best about Jaws, which in any period in the 50s would have absolutely been, a backlot movie, with a plastic shark and, any
Jaws,
town USA.
Jaws, they put a lot of money into Jaws. You go to the Jaws Wikipedia page, there's a lot of great stories on there, like several just on the Wikipedia page. I mean, Steven Spielberg went way over time. Like, I think he went 100 days over time or something, which was like unheard of at that time. One quote that was interesting that I found on Wikipedia was Jaws was the first major motion picture to be shot in the actual ocean. Now, the interesting thing about that is, just imagine, I mean, take a movie like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So back in the olden days, they would shoot these movies on the backlot. And they would shoot them not in the ocean. They'd build a giant water tank, and then they'd put all their stuff into the water tank. So try to imagine Jaws being shot in a tank on a studio backlot. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. You watch Jaws, and there's just so many...
I think that's a good point, because look, there's no way you can use a real shark, so that the shark is going to be the fakest part of it, and so therefore you focus so much on real water and real boats and the things that have tangible depth and volume, and you really play down the shark so that the shark is in the film very, very briefly, and it's the suspense of the shark that really keeps you at your seat. And you can keep the suspense of this while you're in the suspense of the shark. You can focus more on all of the elements visually that are actually real.
Well, I'll tell you another interesting tidbit on the Wikipedia page. Anyway, it says that the production designers were thinking of trying to train actual great white sharks for the shoot, but they, at a certain point, they realized that was impossible. So then they decided to build fake sharks.
And the last half hour of the film takes place entirely on water. And the sequences that take place on the water with boats and swimming and the shark.
They also shot it on a real beach.
On a real beach, yeah.
At Martha's Vineyard, I think a lot of it was shot.
Right, it's an East Coast beach. They make the town of Amityville a real town. It has feeling and it has depth. It's a character. The water is a character. The environment, really, especially by the time you get to the third act, the environment that they're in is the story. Once they get out into the water, they're not going to come back until the end of the film. Oh, spoiler alert, they're not going to come back until the end of the film. So you have to, if you look at, any of the Moby Dick films that came out before this, or anything nautical pirate movies, out to sea had always been so artificial that you just didn't care. And I mean, I won't lie. I mean, it's not like this changed everything. I mean, they built a giant water tank for Titanic, but at least in this film, that last half hour only works because everything is real. So let's go to Deer Hunter, which admittedly is not normally a film that you would connect, but which by title, and if you see the film, you will see that the degree that this film takes place out in nature really dictates so much of what the story is about.
Yeah, let me read this quote from Wikipedia. It sums up almost everything we're talking about here today. This is from the producer, I think, one of the producers. All scenes were shot on location, no sound stages. There was discussion about shooting the film on a backlot, but the material demanded more realism. More realism, says Spikings, the producer. The cast and crew viewed large amounts of news footage from the war to ensure authenticity.
And it's really interesting because Deer Hunter first starts out in a small Pennsylvania town, not Vietnam. The small Pennsylvania town they film in is actually in Pennsylvania. In fact, quick tidbit, my babysitter has a small part in that film. She is one of the bridesmaids of Meryl Streep in that film. You ended up working with her brother. You said he was not a nice guy.
Her brother is a famous Oscar-winning movie director.
You were dealing with him when he was on the downside of life, and he was just a bossy director for an ER episode.
Yeah, he was directing an episode of ER. He's kind of a jerk. He's kind of a jerk off, I guess you could say.
Well, his sister was lovely. Now, I actually didn't see The Deer Hunter until I was in high school, so it was just kind of weird to watch it. But anyway, let's get back to what makes The Deer Hunter, which is that they are actually people who are rural. These are people who go out. These are people who live outdoor lives, and then they are thrown into a completely different world. I don't remember, did they film it in the Philippines to double for Vietnam? I know they did that for Apocalypse Now, which
Yeah, I
we
believe it
aren't
was the
discuss,
Philippines.
but
I don't have that information on hand, but I believe it was the Philippines.
It's similar to Apocalypse Now, which we could have just as easily put in place of Deer Hunter. The nature of being thrown out of civilization, the nature of being thrown out of protective society, the nature of going from being hunter, predator to prey. How do you feel like the naturalism really informs the storytelling?
Well, it really brings you into the location. I mean, he's making a movie about Vietnam, and you actually feel like you're in Vietnam. I mean, you know what's interesting? You can look at John Wayne made a Vietnam movie, but I believe it was all shot in a
Green
studio.
Berets, yeah.
And you look at it. I mean, you can see it's like everything looks totally fake. You know, I'm kind of wondering if maybe one of the things that spurred the search for realism, visual realism, and locations is maybe did the audiences get more sophisticated? I mean, I almost think that maybe that's not the case, but
I think there is a level of sophistication, and I also think the filmmakers really wanted to get beyond the cliches. I mean, there is a very powerful Russian roulette scene in The Deer Hunter. It's filmed outdoors, and it's kind of indoors in that it's a bamboo hut. But if you look at the way the light keeps on shining through this poorly made hut, and you've been outside for so long, it's so savage. And so much of The Deer Hunter is about the savagery of humanity and savagery of man and savagery of warfare. And when you film a movie that takes place out in nature, just like Jaws is about man versus animal and the savagery of nature from a shark to man perspective, here it's the savagery of nature of man to man. Getting out of the soundstage, getting out of the backlot, getting to a place that is visually unique and different, lighting it in a way that seems so realistic to us, makes whatever that is about to happen that's horrific. And technically, both of those films are horrifying films to watch. They're frightening movies. They're savage, they're brutal, they're bloody. But because they're set against backgrounds that look so much more like our own world, unlike, say, a horror movie from the 60s or 40s, it's much more unnerving. And that's why I think it becomes more resonant. Let's lighten it up and talk about comedy. And unfortunately, I don't really want to talk about Woody Allen because of a number of reasons, including the fact that we've just done a lot of New York stuff. There's not a lot of outdoor naturalistic comedy in the 1970s. In fact, Hollywood has got a zero record. There's, I mean, I guess Animal House to a degree, but mostly comedies. A Bad News Bears, fine, okay. But for the most part, like, yeah, now it'll all come to me. For the most part, comedies in the 70s, which I saw a ton of, were studio films. But then there's Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Why don't you set this one up?
Well, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, it's quite notable. I mean, it's a silly comedy, but they wanted absolute realism. According to the Wikipedia page, it was shot on location in Scotland around actual medieval castles. You know, and like we've been talking about with photography, I mean, you watch Monty Python. I mean, visually, it gives the director, cinematographer, a lot of choices of where to put the camera, of how to shoot, you know, and it makes the comedy funnier, doesn't it? I mean, I really
absolutely.
Think this is one of the funniest movies ever because it's grounded in the realism.
It is grounded in so much realism. I mean, in general, there aren't a lot of medieval stories that were made in the 70s, but quite a few of them really did use real locations and real castles. It's very funny, because now when you watch Game of Thrones, that's just the standard, right? But if it wasn't for a comedy like Monty Python that was incredibly successful, I think I literally saw it every time it came back to the theater when it came out, that did use real castles, that really did. In fact, there's an ending, here comes a spoiler, where just regular English police come by at the very end and arrest them, just shattering the illusion. Now, Blazing Saddles did something similar to that, spoiler alert, a few years earlier, but in that one, they just heightened the fact that they take place on a Hollywood set. And while it's kind of funny that this Western goes from a Hollywood set Western to a musical, which no one was making in the 70s, it's funny, haha, funny. But because it's so anachronistic to have the police just shatter what you've believed to be a real medieval castle in a medieval world, it's hysterical. And they would do this again in Life of Brian. And there's a couple of films that take place in the past that do that. And yeah, I would definitely agree. The comedy, we know that the real Middle Ages, things were dirty. People didn't look great. People were filthy. So strangely enough, the and if you see a film Jabberwocky, which I think Terry Gilliam made from the Monty Python world, comes out around then. What they're really doing is just by being so historically accurate, they're mining the comedy. And in doing so, they're kind of really doing a beautiful job of juxtaposing it to what had been the traditional Hollywood stories that take place with Errol Flynn, like Robin Hood, or any of the previous swashbuckler films. In fact, yeah, I think more than anything, even though it's a comedy, after that, there's Excalibur. After Monty Python and the Holy Grail, no one will ever do another film that takes place in the Middle Ages and make it look pretty again. And they'll almost all use real castles, and they'll almost all use a similar aesthetic. And this is a pretty good segue because back to the studio, non-studio films, there are 3 science fiction films, one which isn't really a Hollywood film, so we'll talk about that last, that really also establish what I call a universal naturalistic aesthetic that moving forwards defines the genre in the same way that I think Holy Grail defines how we expect a night film to look. Star Wars, Alien, and even Stalker define how we expect non-2001 style science fiction to look. You want to elaborate a bit on that?
Both Star Wars and Stalker extensively used locations, even though they're science fiction movies, which probably at the time was kind of like a kind of unusual step, right? I mean, because why would you're making a complete fantasy world. Why would you travel around the world to different locations to make the fantasy world look like it's a real, look like it's real? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? But you see what happens.
So Stalker is by a Russian filmmaker or a Soviet filmmaker named Tarakovsky. I cannot pronounce his first name, who had been around since the 60s making hypernaturalistic films, including Andrei Rublev, which is also a great medieval film that actually is a precursor to Monty Python, and the science fiction film Solaris. But Stalker takes place in a forbidden zone. Was it filmed, I believe, primarily in 2 different
He shot at a bunch of
warehouses,
deserted hydroelectric power plants. A bunch of different power plants, and a lot of toxic waste dump areas. And
in there, the lighting is actually slightly off. It's not naturalistic lighting, but because it's juxtaposed with real things, it actually, and I would argue that visually, by using artificial lighting in a way that's unnatural, juxtaposed with this abandoned buildings, it's far more terrifying than the old expressionistic Hollywood sets that would have been made out of whole cloth.
Well, I'm not totally certain, but I think he is using a lot of sunlight, but he's using a special film to give it that weird look, like if you watch that movie Stalker. But yeah, it doesn't look real. It feels weird, right? He's trying to create this eerie feeling just from the look of the movie, and he's pretty successful at it. I mean, the movie Stalker, I would say, is one of the more influential. It's a fantasy film, really, right? But it's super influential because he goes out on these real locations, and he uses lighting tricks and coloring tricks to create the sense of dread and the sense of otherworldliness. And you see it over and over, actually, today.
Science fiction films that you see today pretty much steal their production design or their lighting look from Stalker.
Yeah. You could definitely see it when you watch it.
I mean, that prior to Stalker, they just, there's some stuff, I really wanted to talk about how Planet of the Apes did a very good job of doing something similar with Malibu and Century City and the shopping mall of Logan's Run. And that's true. But This is more, and you see this in Aliens too, is the deterrence, the way of using ugly things, the way of using broken things. We're going to talk about, there's an article on how they built the Millennium Falcon out of what, broken jet engine parts?
Well, Lucas, he told the production designers he wanted everything to look used, and he didn't want anything to stand out. There's a long quote on Wikipedia about this. Lucas called it a used future concept.
Right. But it's a great point. Do you have the article where he talks about how they put together the Millennium Falcon out of the scraps?
Yeah, they used. I mean, it is interesting. They used. Let's see. They used unconventional methods and materials to achieve the desired look. Lucas, he suggested that Lucas, this is the production designer, suggested that Lucas used scrap in making the dressings, and the director agreed. He used to do it with models as a kid. He'd stick things on them to make them look old. Let's see. They wanted the interior of the Falcon to look like a submarine. They found scrap airplane metal. Yeah. No one wanted it in those days, and he broke down jet engines into scrap pieces, and he stuck it in the sets in specific ways. It took him several weeks, it says, to finish the chess set. The garbage compactor set was pretty hard.
But because all of these things, interior-wise, have weight, volume, recognize. He actually uses film editing equipment and film production equipment, just throws it in as if it's part of the Death Star. Well, I remember watching it with my sister, and she's like, that's an editing machine. That's a camera spool. Those are paint guns that they're using. It's such. Go ahead.
I want to say the sets of Star Wars are quite striking. Even today, if you watch, we're talking about Episode 4, the original Star Wars movie. You watch it; the sets are just the amount of care that went into every single little tiny detail of these sets is just extraordinary. I mean, I don't think they even achieved it in Empire. I think Star Wars was the height of the production design.
Well, but in all of these Star Wars films, you've got Tunisia, Arizona, the Redwood Forest of California. These are real spaces that have the ability, kind of like when we were talking about Chinatown, to double. They don't just have to be natural to our world. The other unworldly nature of them. And again, in a weird way, when you look at the desert scenes in Star Wars, especially, I'll go with that. Then I believe that is Tunisia, or is that Arizona, or both? I'm sorry, but either of those desert scenes, because they're real deserts. Now, I'll be honest with you. Lawrence of Arabia was filmed in a real desert, and yes, there is a whole series of beautiful films by people like David Lean and Richard Attenborough that were making films outside of the sound stages, but these were big budget films. So to film your movies out in the deserts for a low budget film, this is quite amazing and expensive but not expensive looking without being expensive. Sorry.
Well, actually shooting out in the desert like they did for Lawrence of Arabia, I mean, that's what made that movie. I mean, that's why Lawrence of Arabia looks so amazing. Fast forward to the Sci-Fi Channel tried to remake the Dune novels on the cheap. And this is after the Lynch Dune, which was actually shot in the desert. But the Sci-Fi Channel made, and if you watched them, you'll see they shot all the desert stuff on sound stages. And it looks pretty bad. It looks pretty bad.
So what is Alien doing here?
I think Alien is mostly sets. It's mostly sound stages. But the care that goes into the Alien sets is just, and this is the first one, it's just absolutely extraordinary. I mean, if you go to the Wikipedia page and read about it, you'll be blown. Let me read about it. I'll read it. A crew of over 200 craftspeople and technicians constructed the three principal sets: the surface of the alien planetoid and the interiors of the Nostromo and the derelict spacecraft. Art director Les Dilley created 1/24 scale miniatures of the planetoid surface and derelict spacecraft based on Geiger's designs, then made molds and casts and scaled them up as diagrams for the wood and fiberglass forms of the sets. Tons of sand, plaster, fiberglass, rock, and gravel were shipped into the studio to sculpt a desert landscape for the planetoid surface, which the actors would walk across wearing spacesuit costumes. The suits themselves were thick, bulky, and lined with nylon, had no cooling systems, and initially no venting for their exhaled carbon dioxide to escape. Combined with a heat wave, these conditions nearly caused the actors to pass out. Nurses had to be kept on hand with oxygen tanks. For scenes involving the exterior of the Nostromo, a 58-foot landing leg, 58 feet, okay, landing leg was constructed to give a sense of the ship's size. I mean, here's the interesting thing. Okay, so this is all pre-computer graphics. So if you fast forward to the recent Alien movies, all that dense, meticulous design that fills every single frame, it's totally gone. Because now...
Go ahead.
Well, now they're filling frames with computer graphics, they're scaling it down. I mean, they had a crew of 200 people who who worked to make the original Alien sets. I think in a lot of ways, one of the reasons these movies are so striking in that era is because even though old Hollywood was starting to die out because they got divested of other theaters or whatever, a lot of the old craftspeople from old Hollywood, they were still there. They were still looking for work, and they were put to work on these crazy 70s movies.
I will say this much about Alien. People are wearing Hawaiian shirts. They're wearing regular T-shirts, underwear, baseball hats. I mean, the space clothing of Alien, and it sounds today, because we just take this for granted, it isn't even futuristic looking clothing. It is quite literally, it's almost jarring to watch them in T-shirts and jeans and jumpsuits and regular people underwear and Hawaiian shirts and baseball caps, but it gives it a lived-in quality. And when you see these people in the future dressed exactly like the audience is now, in a world that's dirty with very small details about this is a hatch here, here's a cargo there, it has so many more of the elements of what we would see ourselves if we were in a cargo ship or in a jet plane. And they really look like guys who work in a cargo ship. Well, they're not slim, they're not pretty. They have there's a gruffness to it. If you see, to this day, another film that really just kind of establishes moving forward after that movie, you will always see some kind of science fiction movie where the people on the ship just wear regular clothing, have normal people bodies, and just look like blue collar folks who got a job to do. And I think it. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that's part of the aesthetic they're trying to achieve. They're trying to convince you of the realness of the images you're seeing. These people are dressed like us because they're real. They're real people.
And unlike Star Wars or even Stalker, which take place in dystopias, it's neither a utopia or a dystopia, the world of Alien. It's not even as cool and hip as the world of 2001. It's just the 1970s working class, working man world 100 years into the future. And the conceit behind it, which was radical at the time, that the future will cause no aesthetic change in the way we dress or the way things look or how clean things will be, is why I think it's such a powerful thing. He'll do it again in Blade Runner and in other films. He started out as an art director, so he has a keen eye. And I think
let me just say one more thing about Alien is the extensive set design in Alien. It makes it, like I was talking about, when you have this crazy amount of effort on the sets, it gives the cinematographer director so many more options of how to shoot. I think if you watch Alien and you compare it visually to the other movies, even Cameron's sequel, you will see that there's much more variety of shots. They're much larger shots. There's landscapes. There's framings that are quite enormous, where you see just so much of a set that doesn't really exist. It's not a location. I don't think you really see that in the subsequent movies.
Yeah, and I think kind of again like Jaws, kind of again like Deer Hunter, like a lot of the films that we've been talking about, the terror and the horror of these films work on a completely different level psychologically, because we believe that this is happening in a world almost identical to our own. The last film I want to bring up, I feel kind of ties in a number of these various elements, is the 1979, directed by Peter Yates, written by Steve Tissick, called Breaking Away. Breaking Away takes place in Bloomington, Indiana, which is the hometown of the University of Indiana. It is very loosely based on Steve Tissick's own life growing up in Indiana in the 60s and a guy he knew. The premise is just very simple. There are these guys, they're townies. Their dads work in the quarry. They built the university. There are these rich kids who go to the University of Indiana. Our protagonist is into cycling and the Italian cycling team. And what's really fascinating about this movie is it's entirely filmed in and around Bloomington, Indiana. Their real homes, the university, the students, the quarries, the guys who work in the quarries. Everything is 100% real. The town, the people, the life is all on location. And because this is a story about a small town boy coming into contact with people from Italy, people from better homes, it's so much about a fish out of water in your own town. It works. Also, it's a sports movie. And unlike, I could have put in Rocky. We could have definitely done Rocky. But the thing about Rocky is, and it's great, filmed entirely on location in Philadelphia, but boxing movies are inherently built for the soundstage. And a lot of sports movies up until that point are built for the soundstage. Not all, but what's great about Breaking Away is bicycling only works outside, and bicycling.
Yeah, I'm trying to rack my brain for a studio bicycle picture. I don't think there was one.
Bicycle Thief.
Oh, well,
get it? That was my master plan, is to bring it back to bicycle. No, it wasn't. But the whole joy of him going on those bike rides requires that you actually have countryside and lanes and cars and real objects in order to feel the joy. Just like when you see them jumping off in the quarry, it's a real quarry. It's incredibly dangerous. One of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is Paul Dooley, who becomes a used car salesman who used to work in the quarry. And for some reason, he goes back to the quarry, real quarry, where real guys are working, and operates the machines with the guys. It's just a sequence of him blowing off steam by hanging out with his old friends, operating equipment. And it's 100% real. And by watching it, it really informs you. Every character in the film is informed by actual environmental things. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture and for Best Screenplay. I've been over talking. What do you want to say about Breaking Away? Because
no, you covered it.
It's the kind of movie that could never have been made in a soundstage. It's not a sports film in the traditional way that sports films are about victory.
Well, there is.
It's about growing up in a town,
right?
And it doesn't work unless it's a real town with real people. There's a scene where there's like 20,000 people at the university stadium cheering on bike racers. Those are actually real students.
Right.
There to really cheer on. I mean, everything about it is so informed. And one of the beautiful effects of all of these films is it's so much easier to buy into the stakes and the drama when what you're looking at, is honestly, truly real.
Right. Well, there's one thing I wanted to say is, so Breaking Away, it's like an early version, I think, I want to say, of the Netflix model, where you pick a location and then you write a story to fit the location, and you really get all you can out of the location. Like for instance, the show Ozark on Netflix. they name it after a place. It's not
But
even.
Ozark's actually filmed in Atlanta.
I know. I know.
But that's my point. Breaking Away is filmed. I mean, it's the story of Bloomington. Yes, it's really more the story of Bloomington in the 60s when the university opened up. But it doesn't matter because that part of the world, time does stand still.
But you see that a lot in coming up. You know, it's like a filmmaker will go somewhere and they'll shoot a movie at a location and they incorporate things from that location, not just the people, but and landmarks, but even the feel of the location.
Grew up there, and there's this beautiful scene where the dad is walking with his son on the campus, and he's talking about how hard they worked to build the campus, and this is their first time walking on the campus, and because it's as reflective of Bloomington as any of the New York or LA stories are reflective of New York or LA, but Bloomington could never be really recreated even on a Hollywood soundstage. It would look like Oklahoma. So that is I really think that the height of all of this culminates with that film. I'll also say, because I saw many of these films in the theater and you saw them later, because they were not filmed on sound stages, because they were filmed in real places, they're wonderful time capsules that we can look back on and see what life was like 40, 50 years ago. And they will always be time in a bottle for that. And they'll always have something more to tell us about how we lived in that period of time that these soundstage movies can never touch.
Yeah, you don't really get that time capsule feeling from a lot of the soundstage movies for the classic Hollywood. I guess I should talk about how the end of this era, right, Chris? I mean,
very briefly.
I'll very briefly talk about
its own show. We will talk about that era in a separate episode. That's why I'm saying. Right.
Well, I just want to briefly mention it because people are going to be wondering, like, what happened? Well, what happened was there were, like, I think in the 80s, I mean, I would contend that in the 80s, there were a series of disastrous financial failures of movies of this type where you take, like, a giant crew, you go on location, you give the director a lot of freedom to just shoot stuff. So, like, some of these movies are like Heaven's Gate, Dragon Slayer, Blade Runner, Dune, Greystoke, Brazil, Flesh and Blood, Ishtar, Gardens of Stone, Fresh Horses, Showgirls, major disaster. And then you get to 1997, okay, and you get this little tiny movie called Titanic, and probably the kids that are too young to remember when it came out. One of the big selling points for Titanic was computer graphics
and a giant soundstage.
It was a giant soundstage, but the big draw, I think one of the major draws for Titanic was that we had some amazing computer graphics. And by the way, the computer graphics of Titanic were like terrible.
but I will also say,
people flocked to see them.
Equally important as its legacy coming into the 80s is a lot of guerrilla filmmaking, independent filmmaking, people like Spike Lee, people like Steven Soderbergh. There's going to be a whole generation of filmmakers that are going to come out in the 80s that are going to use it. So it's a legacy that in some senses ends. It's a legacy that continues today, but it all happened in that period between 1970 and 1980, and the legacy and the change still exists today because there's no films that Hollywood makes today that looks anything like the films pre-1970, pre-68. And even when you're watching these movies from the 70s today, so many of them on a visual aesthetic have aged really well. I know because I just watched Breaking Away a few months ago with my girlfriend, and she was so amazed on how the universality, how well it's kept. And I think if you watch any of the films we've just mentioned, and please do, I think you'll see what we mean about the fact that the choices they made allowed it not only just to be a great timepiece, but also give it much more relevance and prescience so that it still works on us emotionally. It makes us laugh. It makes us scared. It makes us feel what we feel because the world that it portrays is still a world which we live in today. Any last words, Randall?
No, that was very good, Chris. Thank you.
All right. Well, Randall, this was an awesome show. We'll definitely pick up on the fall at some other points. We'd love to know what you guys think, whether you were alive in the 70s or not, if there was some film we overlooked, or if there's a film we should have gone into greater depth. You know how to reach us, as Randall said. Until then, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
We'll talk again.
Bye.
Bye.